Now within that general sociological analysis of the society transforming theme, we are of course presenting Shakyamuni and his successors as not just otherworldly ascetics who are seeking to leave the hopeless world, as Max Weber and from then on most Western people teach you about Buddhism, but we are seeing them as having sociological, ethical, socially transformative attitudes and insights as well. And so within that framework of those three different methods that they used, we now look at some of the details of how they changed things. And so now we say between the time of Shakyamuni and Ashoka, in those couple of centuries, the Magadha kingdom, originally the kingdom of Bimbisara, who was the Buddha's most fervent patron, expanded into an empire, consolidating the 16 city-state kingdoms of Buddha's society into an empire, one single empire, called the Nanda Empire. Then Ashoka's grandfather, who was a general for that empire, created a federation of generals to repel Alexander the Great when he tried to invade India. And subsequently, he then turned that army against his master, and he rebelled against the Magadhan Empire and created the Mauryan Empire, which was expanded violently by Ashoka when he was a young prince, beating his rivals and bringing in other countries into the empire, adding Orissa and some parts of the Deccan and southern India and so on, and Bengal. And then when he repented of that violence, as famously he did, he Buddhified it all by building many stupas and supporting the Sangha everywhere. And during that period, India became more cheerful, as less militaristic, but again more vulnerable. So Ashoka, by expanding monasticism and supporting it broadly, he made and that lessened his imperial military power. And then after him, after a generation or two, the Kushans, who are the Scythians or the Bactrians, however they're called in Western documents from Central Asia, maybe Tajik people really, or Turkic, Tajik, Mongolian type people, they came in and conquered northern India and created a long-lasting empire, which lasted from the 2nd century before the Common Era to the 3rd century of the Common Era, stretching all the way from Central Asia north of Tibet, well into India, including Pataliputra, Ashoka's capital in modern-day Bihar province, which is the Buddhist Holy Land. Example of course, how deeply interwoven Buddhism is in all of these developments is that the state of Bihar today in modern India is named after the Sanskrit word vihara, which means a monastery, a Buddhist monastery. Those were the viharas. There were so many of them in that area. Culturally absorbed by their subject peoples, these Kushans followed the Ashokan model. Even though they were the conquerors, they still followed that model of manifesting a balanced and healthy society and became big sponsors of the Buddhist Sangha community. Under their patronage, the Buddhist monasteries as seats of learning began to serve the lay population as well as the mendicant populations as big universities. And so much so that when the Gupta Indian dynasty emerged out from under the Kushans in the 4th and 5th century of the Common Era, the Sangha community increased ever more in strength due to the fact that its universities were serving the Hindu imperial society inevitably and indispensably. And so the Guptas became major patrons and stronger patrons than ever of the Buddhist universities and the monastic universities. And so modern scholars are confused about all this, since they still think of Buddhism as merely an otherworldly religion, and so they see things in terms of Buddhism like any religion is just a marginal thing, or when it gets involved it competes with Hinduism, which is a more mainstream thing in India, they think. And they think Hinduism just coming from Vedas, of course wrongly, and instead of it as a meeting of Vedas and Buddhism. But in fact, the Buddhist educational services were offered to all educated Indic peoples, regardless of religious affiliations, the Buddhist universities being the seed beds of the emerging Indic civilization. It was science and art and knowledge and psychology and all of this, and art and literature and everything was coming from those universities for 1,000 years. And there was no serious, anti or non-Buddhist work until late in the Gupta era. And a gap from around the Buddha's time was a very flowering period of the Upanishads and everything, of Hindu things, and the beginning of Hindu merging with Buddhism around that time. Then there was a long blank of Indian commentaries to around 500-600 of the Common Era, when suddenly in the latter Gupta period they start establishing their own kind of universities around the courts of the Hindu kings. Now, this culture, glorious culture of 500 CE in ancient India, was distinguished from other imperial cultures of the era. Well, Roman one was pretty much going down the drain by then, but although it had spread around throughout Europe, the Sasanian, the Chinese, Iran and East Asia. But the Indian one was distinguished by its unmatched merchant class-based wealth and resources. The military government was not completely controlling the merchants in India, which made it much wealthier, and it created larger urbanization and therefore more educated and more sophisticated population than those other much more militarized empires. Its widespread support of monastics, which they didn't even have, and they were very grudging about, although a little bit began under the Romans, and their institutions of learning, its advanced sciences and arts, its relatively peaceful, non-expansionary nature under the aegis of a shared ethic of tolerance, nonviolence, and even vegetarianism in the Indian case, as we studied previously in the Ashokan, looking at the Ashokan edicts, its scientific, psychological, and medical sophistication, resulting in unique physical and mental yogic disciplines, and its refined literature is both creative and critical. The Indic Buddhist historical memory is largely lost, unfortunately, due to the 12th century destruction of the universities and their libraries under culturally Islamic, Iranian, and Tajik invasions and occupations. Though some Indic Buddhist elements were major contributors to every other Asian culture for over 1,000 years, as still today, the Tibetan civilization, itself a product of the Indic Buddhist civilizing culture, was unique in its comprehensive preservation of the Indic Buddhist traditions. Though the great library system of Nalanda University, the 9-story high ocean of jewels, Ratnodadi set of buildings, was completely destroyed in 1172 of the Common Era. Fortunately for 4,000 to 5,000 of its most important works had already been translated into Tibetan over the previous 4 centuries, of which only 10% went into Chinese and 15% into Pali. In addition, the experiential traditions of the great adepts were carefully transmitted into Tibetan lineages of advanced practitioners, so that the practicing traditions, oral traditions, mind-to-mind transition, so to speak, the yogic traditions of the actual adepts were also translated into Tibet. So both the scholarly curriculum and the scholarly development of the Buddhist sciences and arts went into the huge Tibetan Buddhist monastic universities, continuing the Indian Buddhist monastic universities, but also the yogic adept traditions went into yogic adept lineages in Buddhist Tibetan caves and wildernesses and wandering adepts who were very high, such as Milarepa, as we will see later as we come to that.